At SEF Pallav, we are very glad to welcome you to the SEF Colloquium series. No? I first met Pallav in Bogota, Colombia, during the International Symposium on Environmental Thinking and Alternatives to Development within the framework of the DSSP program. And since then, the interest on collaborating has grown from both sides, I think. And to introduce Pallav, of course, it's not easy. He has done a lot. But let's say, summarizing that he has pursued a twin-track career in environmental conservation and creative communications. His involvement with environmental campaigns goes back to the late 70s when, even as a teenager, he co-founded one of the first environmental action groups in India called Kalpavriksh. I hope I said it properly.
Yes, yes.
And lately, Pallav focused on understanding the impact of climate change and the contemporary paradigm for energy production in the developing world. No? Pallav is also the editor of the Radical Ecological Democracy website, an internet platform exploring alternatives to the contemporary neoliberal, socioeconomic, and political order. He has designed and launched innovative campaigns, produced also documentaries, particularly those that include insightful films on violence against women and the threat of HIV and AIDS among street children. Lastly, but not less important, is that he's co-author of a book on trekking in the Himalayas, which grew out of his own experience exploring this great mountain chain. So Pallav, the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Denise, and I see Eva is here too. So good afternoon to you too, Eva. Hi, long time. And I must apologize for the last time, but this is a strange virus. It has a residual kick, and it can kick in as and when it feels like. And so just a couple of days before the last presentation, it kicked in. And unfortunately, I had to cancel and then postpone. And thanks a lot to Denise for being kind enough to give me another time. So I'm going to be speaking about Radical Ecological Democracy, which is this initiative which has been started by a group. I have been involved with this group for a long time, and this is how I intend to make the presentation. I'll give you a very brief introduction to what how Kalpavriksh came about, what is Vikalp Sangam, or the Confluence of Alternatives. These I had done in greater detail at the Bogota conference, but I will be dealing more with Radical Ecological Democracy, what its principles are. I'll discuss briefly the relationship between development and conflict, what conflict in India looks like arising out of development, and how, looking at a couple of examples, how Radical Ecological Democracy is being used to address conflict in India. Obviously, this is not a formal practice. This is how we look at it. And we see that what we are trying to formulate is already in existence in India in terms of grassroots activities. So coming to Kalpavriksh, it was in 1979. We were still in school, and we had a very, we loved our school. It allowed us the freedom to experiment, to be involved in quasi-political issues, and the school was able to sort of direct us in certain directions where civil engagements were encouraged. And so what we decided was that from our environmental club, we started sort of exploring opportunities to get engaged with civic issues, particularly environmental issues, and um, a local forest, a city forest was being uh, developed. And this city forest has this poster in front says Ridge Forest. It's called the Ridge Forest, uh, Delhi's lifeline. And these are boys and girls from my school, 1979. Even though we loved our school, we hated that rust-colored jumper that we were forced to put on. I must put this on record. And so we also formed a relationship with local neighborhood bodies, and we were able to we succeeded in stopping this development program. And as that happened, we realized that there were other opportunities, and we formed a sort of a formal group. I'm not going to go into the details of what that group did, but these are the things that we got involved in. We looked at conservation from a people's perspective. We looked at the relationship between development and environment. We got very deeply involved with environmental education, public advocacy. We created channels of solidarity with grassroots organizations in other parts of the country. And finally, we started delving into the idea of alternatives. And as my friend and colleague Ashish Kothari says, that no resistance can win without an alternative vision. And we decided that we needed to look at systemic change, and we needed to look at how to create alternatives without just continuing to harp upon what was wrong with society, and instead start providing alternatives as much as possible as an organization. So we've been around for now 40 years, more than 40 years. And in 2014, we formed Vikalp Sangam, or the Confluence of Alternatives. Vikalp means alternatives, Sangam means confluence in Sanskrit. Uh, we formed a solidarity organization with three other organizations. Bhumi is involved in education. Shikshantar is also involved in education. Deccan Development Society is a terrific organization. If you look at how power hierarchies work, then you will realize in India, being a woman is a challenge, being a tribal is a challenge, and being a farmer is a challenge. This organization is actually run by tribal women who are farmers, and they've done exceptionally good work in terms of creating opportunities for women farmers, tribal farmers in very backward areas, and they are a great source of inspiration for us. So what we are doing is that seeking solutions to environmental development and educational challenges. And so we wanted to figure out what an alternative actually looks like. And you will realize as I'm going through these slides, what we've tried to do is to create very basic, very simple perspective and definitions and ideas about alternatives, about ecological democracy. So we look at alternatives as being, our sense of alternatives is that it should be committed to simplicity and sufficiency. It should be self-reliant. It should respect dignity of both labor and work. There should be equity between physical and intellectual labor, and it emphasizes the ecological limits of human activity. And most importantly, coming from where we originate from, it looks at rights of nature to survive and thrive. And this is an important slide. I'll probably come back to it if need be. Uh, we look at the idea of well-being being the fundamental fulcrum of what alternatives should aspire to. So we look at secure ways of meeting basic needs, being healthy, access to opportunities for learning, being employed in satisfactory and meaningful tasks, good social relationships, and leading culturally and spiritually fulfilling lives. And all this, I must emphasize, has come through discussions. And this is not a group of, 5 or 6 Politburo members or anything like that. This is a whole group which has been discussing, deliberating over these ideas, and have, and over a lot of deliberations which have taken place in various conclaves. I'll tell you more about these conclaves and in and groups like these, where we discuss these matters and we come to a consensus without really anything being forced upon anybody. So what I mean by conclaves is we take on a particular subject, or we take on an issue of a particular region, and we go to that region in India. And so we've been, and then bring local experts, local grassroots organizations to lead those deliberations, and come to a sort of a consensus on what those issues are, which are important to people. So we've already been involved with 18 conclaves. Last year, of course, has been a challenge. So that's a lot of conclaves since 2014. As I said, they bring thinkers and practitioners together. They are a space for an exchange of ideas and experiences. And and what is really credit worthy, and for us as an organization, and how we have interacted with a lot of other people all over the country, what is really remarkable is that we've been able to bring people who've never mattered in other people's eyes, in the society's eyes. But these are people, grassroots people, farmers, workers, who have been involved in their own work, have expertise in their own work, but have never had the opportunity to share what they can contribute to society. And we've brought those people and we've learned from them, and they have really felt confident about what they want to achieve in their own in their own pursuits. And this process has helped build bridges. And so that is the most important aspect of Vikalp Sangam. And so these are some of the subject ideas that we have taken up. As you can see, it's a very broad spectrum. Water management, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, decentralized government, media, all kinds of things. And this has led to what we call that, we've filtered through our experience, and we have taken this leap of an ideological stance, as well as a future, a possibility of designing a new future. And that's what we call radical ecological democracy. So what is radical ecological democracy? It's a social, cultural, political, and economic arrangement, and where all people and all communities have the right and full opportunity to participate in decision making. That is the most important thing, that we want to emphasize decision making as being a responsibility and a right for everybody. It should not be confined to a few people just because they have been elected to a certain position. And finally, and most importantly, this decision making is based on twin fulcrums of ecological sustainability and human equity. So what is ecological sustainability and what is human equity? So we've tried to define that also and we call these our first principles. Ecological sustainability is the continuing integrity of the ecosystem and ecological functions on which all life depends, including the maintenance of biological diversity as the fulcrum of life. This is, again, going back to our roots in Kalpavriksha, this is an important part of our own existence, and that's why, in our history, and that's why it's an important first principle for us. Human equity is a mix of equality of opportunity, access to decision making, equity in the distribution and enjoyment of the benefits of human endeavor, and of cultural security, where cultural culture is not imposed upon you, whether it's Western culture or a dominant Indian culture. It is what people want to ascribe to their own lives. So radical ecological democracy is something which is at an experimental stage right now, but it still has certain core values. It forms an alternative to top-down ideologies, and instead of the state and the corporation, it puts collectives and communities at the center of governance. It respects the limits of Earth. And as I describe what radical ecological democracy is, I will then pivot to why we think radical ecological democracy is an interesting perspective on understanding conflict and development. So that obviously raises the question, what is development? And I'm careful in this group to, who are all experts in the area of development. So I have chosen to include a definition which is not ours, but which is from the Society for International Development, and which says that it is a process that creates growth, progress, and positive change, and the addition of physical, economic, environmental, social, and demographic components, and that the purpose of development is a rise in the level and quality of life, the creation, expansion of regional income and employment opportunities, and without damaging the resources of the environment. And we'll see whether the current process of development in India and elsewhere is holding on to that promise. So when we look at development and conflict uh, from our perspective of radical ecological democracy, we try to figure out why does conflict happen, and we see that obviously there is a diversity of stakeholders, actors, and interest groups who are involved in this process of development. In India, where contrasts are stark and contrasting images are always together, here you can see rich high-rise apartments right next to very poor hovels. And so we see that there is a conflict of interest here between those who are at a certain advanced stage of economic development and those who are not. And then you see that there is a variety of economic and socio-political rationalities and expectations that people have with the idea of development. This is a very poor neighborhood. About 400 million people live in similar neighborhoods in India. And you can imagine that their expectations are very different from the expectations of a group like this, the richest Indians who are emitting carbon at an average of 5 tons per capita per year, which is equal to the highest emission of carbon in some of the richest countries. So you have a development paradigm where the expectations and the rationalities of a small group are actually driving the development agenda in India. And how they rationalize and interpret development is very different from what people experience. So this is a typical scenario with the river, which is the most, which is considered the most, uh, uh, the holiest of Indian rivers, the Ganga River, as you can see only in name, where almost 3,000 million liters a day of sewage is dumped into this river. And so these differences in interpretations of development outcomes, which are based on unequal relationships, is uh, a feature of Indian development. And those differences in interpretations lead to different expectations, and that can create conflict, as you will see uh, in some of the coming slides. And that diverse understanding of complexities leads to social tensions, leads to resistance, and leads to possible conflict. And as you can see, that uh, this is a typical picture of what uh, dumps look like in India, and what uh, the the economic reality of a large number of people is, where their survival depends on foraging in dumps. When India opened up its economy 30 years ago, it had about 1/5 of the world's poorest. Despite all the big claims of the various governments which have ruled since then, that number has actually gone up to 1/3. So the other aspect of development and conflict is uh, manifested in the ferocious quest for natural resources and territories uh, from an actively diminishing pool. So this is the other aspect, that capitalism and neoliberalism to survive and thrive needs larger and larger and fresher territories. And that's what is happening in India, uh, where tribal and inner areas are being uh, sort of colonized by the growing arm of Indian corporations, and leading to other possibilities of conflict. So there are conflicts uh, where public protest is the instrument of expression, but there are other ways in which people also express their disappointment and their uh, resistance. You may have heard of the recent farmers' movement in India against three neoliberal uh, laws which are going to take away farmers' autonomy and bring corporations in a big way into the farming areas. There are almost 60% of Indian people who are dependent on farming, on small land holdings, and they feel threatened now. There have been these tractor marches. There have been big public meetings in hinterland areas, beginning in the northern states and now sort of spreading all over the country. And some of uh, the, the government uh, responses have been mild form of reprisals, but in those areas where there has been armed rebellion, which has been going on for almost 2 decades, and which in fact has, the history takes us into the 1960s, these are ultra-left groups where violent reprisals are really, really sort of uh, tragic, and a fresh look at what development could look like in the coming years is necessary. And that's why we think that radical ecological democracy is an interesting perspective and a workable perspective. So when we look at the models which are being forced upon the developing world, we look at this Western model this is a very typical picture, and this is a picture which is being recreated and reenacted all over India too. And we realize that this is not a democratic model. This is a model which is imposed by Western imperialist uh, agencies, and we think that there is a need for looking beyond a monolithic model of economic and political governance. We think that citizen participation is necessary in decision making, which means that it has to go beyond the representative forms of democracy where people participate only in elections. Instead, there should be citizen participation on all important issues, and decentralization of power at the grassroots level in policies, and particularly budgetary policy. And so what do we mean by, how do we achieve this kind of decentralization? We call it a twin-pronged attempt. Localization is one perspective, and eco-regionalism is another perspective. So what do we mean by localization? Am I doing fine on time, Denise?
Yes, please, you have like around 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay. So localization is sort of diametrically opposed to globalization, and it's based on this belief that those who live closest to the resource should be able to manage because they have the greatest stake and they often have the best knowledge to manage it. That is localization. And eco-regionalism is development which is based on the unique ecology of a particular region, and it's not a political uh, um, territory, but it is a territory which shares the ecological characteristics of that particular area, and it promotes sustainability in harmony with that region and puts ecologically and socially fragile and important lands into some form of conservation, and it has a mutually beneficial rather than parasitic relation between towns and rural areas. So I'm going to give you swiftly two examples, one of localization and another of eco-regionalism. The localization which took place at this village called Ralegan Siddhi in the western state of Maharashtra was really a very, very remarkable experience. What was going on in that village was it was drought prone, there was large scale migration to towns, people had enormous health issues, low agricultural productivity, rampant illegal distilling of alcohol, and obviously social conflicts resulting in violence, particularly against women. And what was uh, what happened amazingly was there was this man called Anda Sahib Hazare. He was an ex-army man, and he knew that community and its culture and traditions, and he recognized watershed management as the primary problem for the village. And he went to the community and shared his plan with the community and started showing some results through small scale watershed management, and then started including an entire area around the village in that watershed management. All the decision making, as I've been emphasizing, were the responsibility of the village council. It was not a plan which was imposed upon by the local government or the state government or the national government. It was the local people with their own genius and their own traditions and their own experience base who were able to create this complete change in the in the nature and character of both local politics, local policy making, and obviously it had its impact on the village itself. The eco-regionalism example which I want to to share with you is really it's a very, very outstanding example of how people can create their own policy making avenues in cooperation with the larger state structures. So uh, uh, this is a river system called the Arvari River in another western state. It is actually a very dry region. It's very popular among tourists. It's called Rajasthan. Uh, it's called the Arvari River, and which had been dry for 80 years. Agriculture had suffered, and agriculture was entirely dependent on rains. That is an agriculture which is dependent on rains in a desert area. So you can imagine that productivity was very low. There was rampant poverty in the entire region along the river, and there was lack of employment, and there was crime, and there was conflicts. And this is the Arvari River, which is now flowing all through the year. And uh, and what has happened is that again, a young man called Rajendra Singh, a local youth leader, started work on water conservation. Again, a theme which sort of, which comes again and again, that how water is the source of life. And once you have command over that source, you start bringing in change. So they started building traditional water storage tanks along the river. And this is not a, mind you, it's not a small achievement. It is a conservation program which took place for 12 years over all along the 400 kilometers of this river. And by 1996, the river started flowing again. And, and in 1999, 72 villages along the river formed what they called the Arvari Parliament. And why they did that was that when the water started flowing, the state government gave a contract, a commercial contract, to a company for fishing in that area, and the people objected. And when the people objected, the state government moved the High Court and said that the people shouldn't come in between the state government and a corporation, which is acting in the interest of people because of a development, with a development scheme. So the people said, okay, and so the High Court said, if the people are able to create their own agency to look after and manage the river, then the state government will have to withdraw. And so the people formed their own parliament, and this parliament meets twice every year, and now the river flows all year round. The land under cultivation has increased fivefold, and the parliament makes, as you can see, integrated plans and programs for land, for agriculture, for water, for wildlife, for development, and taking care of conflict in the region. That is law and order. So that is an amazing thing that this initiative was able to do. And these two initiatives match so well with our idea of radical ecological democracy. So this is where I'll end and say that our idea of grassroots ecological democracy is actually already being implemented in India by grassroots organizations. Thank you.
This is great, Pallav. Thank you very much for these very lively examples of social movements in actions and all the rationale behind this resistance, against inequality, against environmental degradation and human rights abuses. Very interesting and graphic. So I myself would have many questions and comments to your very interesting presentation, but I have to open the floor to others as the moderator. So I will ask you all, please. I see now already 2 hands up. All the rest, please just feel free to also raise your blue hands under the participants. First of all, Andre, please.
I thank you. I have a question about the protests of the Indian farmers, since this is one of the topics. I mean, not Indian farmers, but I do work with agricultural development. And I'd like to understand a bit more the reason for this protest and your take on that, because from what I saw, the laws give new legal possibilities for Indian farmers to sell their produce. So instead of being legally required to sell a certain percentage to government marketing boards, they have more options to sell it to private traders, processor, marketers. So does the main concern lie in the concentration of the crops buying these crops, or in the hands of a few big agribusiness firms? So if that's the case, wouldn't it be better to address this market concentration instead of correcting it by limiting farmers selling options? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of reasons why people are objecting uh, to the entry of the corporations into agriculture, and particularly um, to both as markets as well as uh, decision makers in what the farmers would be able to uh, sow and harvest. So what the farmers are saying is that we don't have the wherewithal. Most farmers in India, almost 83% of farmers in India are small landholders, 2 acres at the most, and they say, and most of them are much lower than that. So you can imagine they say that they don't have the wherewithal and the experience of being able to engage with commercial operations to sell their crops, and they say that we will be taking all the risks. We are dependent on nature for our yields. We will be dependent on uh, those um, those attributes of our uh, of our agriculture, of India's agriculture, which has not changed much. And they say that we will then be at the uh, 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 at the risk of the business organizations taking all the decisions on how much that uh, crop will sell for commercially. So they're saying that our risk increases further. And so what they've done is that they have said that we want to renegotiate this because this was never a part of the central government, the party which is in power, uh, BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party. It was never a part of the manifesto of the government when it came into when it when it contested the last election. So what they're saying is that this has been a sneaky move on part of the government. They say withdraw these three laws and let's renegotiate on the basis of what the reality of the country is, rather than imposing a program and a plan and a scheme which has come from the IMF and the World Bank. And so what the other issue which is really bothersome to them is that uh, once the corporations come into the farming sector, what happens is that it will create its own sort of momentum, and it will impose new uh, socio-cultural pressures on a society which is very traditional and where people have deep roots into religion, into local culture, and they say this is a BJP agenda also to change that into a sort of a pan-Indian Hindu identity, which they don't share and don't believe in. So this is a twin-pronged economic and cultural attack which the BJP wants to perform in the vast agricultural areas of the country, and that's why the opposition.
Thank you, Pallav. Thank you very much. The next one, please, is Eva.
Yeah, thank you for this exciting presentation and also for updating us on these activities and presenting this exciting Avari case. I somehow have two questions to you. In one of your slides, I've seen a banner with the slogan "System Change, not Climate Change." And when we, as CEF, mainly CEF-A researchers, present our reflexive, maybe also radical, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach to development studies, we've been asked several times whether we opt for alternatives to development or development alternatives. And I would like to know whether this question is somehow controversially discussed within your movement or not. And then maybe another question which somehow is also linked to that. The Avari case somehow would be a lighthouse project, let's put it like this, to be presented as a successful project within the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, where would you see the differences of the approach of your approach and the Sustainable Development Goals, and what have we overseen? What did we overseen within the SDGs? Is it, well, democracy, decentralization is also, or forms also very important cornerstones for reaching the SDGs, but somehow there is a missing link.
Yes, thank you, Eva. Very important and dare I say, very tough questions. For us, in the last now 40 years, we've grown up with this organization despite our own personal meanderings, and Ashish obviously has been with the organization all through, and his leadership has sustained the organization. And this question of whether it is alternatives to development, or is it development alternatives, or is it the two of them blending together in some form? And I would say that we have sort of been also we've been challenged by this dichotomy also, because what happened, and I'll give you an example, what happened in the late 80s and the 90s was an organization which set up roots in Delhi called Development Alternatives. And it was a very exciting organization, and we thought that this organization is going to show a way forward in terms of how India should look at development. He was a man who came from a development, Western development experience, and he came back to India. He was an Indian man, and he set up this organization. But slowly we realized that, what happens is that, these perspectives, these attempts, these initiatives, and these experiments get co-opted into the larger, powerful world of international development. And so his idea of, and their idea of development alternatives slowly got sort of financially co-opted by larger development organizations just to survive. It was so difficult for him to survive that he started taking help from established organizations, which meant that he was forced to compromise on his own idea of development alternatives. And then we tried to, because we then also had to disassociate ourselves from this organization, we started looking at, as I said, that in 2014, we started looking at alternatives to development. And we realized that there is this a sort of a political and social and economic pressure which accompanies the idea of development, which has been practiced for so many years in the West. And because those are the development organizations which also push that agenda, that idea of development alternatives has also been suspect and has also been more a dysfunctional experiment in countries like India, rather than developing our own idea of what the alternatives are to development. And I would say that these are alternatives to life-sustaining activities rather than just the notion of development. I think that's how we look at it, that how do you sustain life, how do you live your life is very different from the idea of development. And the development perspective in itself, I think, sort of embodies this pressure and this force of developing, of growth, of reaching for the stars. And even though we do think that there is a certain ambition within every individual human being to reach for the stars, we think that there is no set definition of reaching for the stars economically, politically, and socially. I think it should be left to people to decide rather than being forced to sort of be co-opted into one particular definition of development. That's how that's how we look at it, that development in itself is a problematic word. We look at it as life-sustaining activities, and we look at the relationship with Earth as a sacred primary attribute of that relationship. So coming to what Arwari Parliament did and whether it matches with sustainable development approach, I would say that I think in terms of formal ideas of decentralization, of local democracy, I think it matches those goals very well. But it goes beyond that, because these are ideas which have sprung from the genius of these people. So the person that I talked to you about, Rajendra Singh, let me go back to this. Rajendra Singh, a local youth leader, he was actually a traditionally trained health practitioner, not a Western doctor, but a traditionally trained health practitioner. And he has roots in this area, but he had been away from, his family had been away from this area for a long time. But he came back with the idea of working in this area with the with the aim of improving the health of the people using traditional methods. But the people said that our health is bad, but our health is not because of an isolated case of health being the issue. They said that our entire economic paradigm is suffering. We don't really know what exactly is the way in which our people will stay in the villages. They are migrating to the towns. We don't have any agriculture. Our agriculture is suffering because we don't have access to water. And these are issues which are sort of troubling us more than the issue of health. And so he's then started thinking about, what is the basic premise of life-sustaining possibilities in this region. And he said that this river has been dry for 80 years. And he said, there were these traditional ways in which water harvesting was done, watershed management was done, and he didn't know anything about it. So he went around looking for people who were traditionally trained in water harvesting and uh, and and uh, and uh, and uh, digging these and building these johars, these traditional water storage tanks, so as to sort of create a flow into the river. And he started learning those that technique, that traditional technology from those people, and then he developed this whole idea. So what I'm trying to say is that sustainable development goals is again a great idea which is imposed from the top. And why it fails is it does not include the genius of the people, their own agency. And we are very, very humbled now. And even as, sort of trained in Western models and sort of living in towns and being able to speak in a foreign language, which is common internationally, we are humbled by the genius of our own people, and we recognize that they have the best ideas to work on their problems. And that's why we say that radical ecological democracy is not about extremes. By radical, we mean get down to the roots, get down to the grassroots. The problems are there, but the solutions are absolutely there. That's how we look at sustainable goals of development or development in the larger perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallav. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to take the opportunity to ask my questions since there are no more people. Like I see no more hands here. And I would like to go back to the issue of the peasant strikes in India because it is extremely relevant. It's called the biggest peasant strike in history because of the quantity of people involved and because of all the support that has received from very different parts of the world, no? And we know that people who are pushing for the views for degrowth, Buen Vivir, the Ubuntu, so they are all supporting this movement. And my question is whether these strikes are let's say, just a reaction to these laws that were passed by the government, or whether it has really the energy, the momentum to really push for a real change, because I know the government is betting for people getting tired, but if it's really possible that this will create something more than just a reaction, and what is the role of Vikalp Sangam in all this picture?
So let me start by saying that we don't have any particular organizational role. We do support the farmers movement. We are part of a national movement of national organization of people's movement. So through that association, we do have our own channels of engagement and support, but we are not part of the larger movement because this is a grassroots movement and this is being led by the farmers themselves. And as I said that, in the brief introduction to conflict and the farmers movement, it is it is a response to the farmers' laws, the farm laws, but it is also a response to a lot of pent-up anguish, anxiety, which has been felt by people for a very long time in the Indian agricultural in the Indian agricultural sector. And as I said, almost 60% of the Indian people have links of sustaining their lives in some form or the other, as farmers, as labor, as traders, uh, and, and, and they are part of the rural framework, the rural firmament of India, which is traditional, which has been around for thousands of years, and which forms the fulcrum of the Indian socio-cultural existence. So it is a response to that threat also. It is not just an economic response, it is very much a socio-cultural response. And you will, I mean, if you follow it, and if I have the opportunity to come back to you in some other forum, I would be able to sort of deal with this more thoroughly. But it is a tremendous example of political activism, which is completely shouldered by people themselves through their own fund collection, through their own, I mean, people have come to the border areas of the capital city, 4 or 5 different locations where farmers bring in their trucks and their food in their trolleys, and not just for themselves, obviously. They are there for the next 6 months, next 9 months. They are organized. They are so well managed. They are peaceful. I mean, there is no sense of sort of desperation. They say that we are here to stay in these locations for as long as it is necessary. And we will spread our message all over the country. And now the northern states of Punjab, of Haryana, and the state of UP, where particularly Western UP and parts of Rajasthan, which is all, if you look at the Indian map, this is the agricultural heartland of India. This was what sort of brought caravans, migrations all over all through ages, invasions, military interventions, the British rule. Everything was because of the attraction of the productivity of this land, the Indo-Gangetic um, uh, agriculture area, which is now divided between India and Pakistan. And it is the sort of the fulcrum of India's socio-cultural existence. And what they're saying is that we are not going to go without a fight. And they obviously are very confident they're going to win. And they know why, because they're all sort of very well equipped to figure out what the future looks for them and what is good for them and their families. And they are so committed to the socio-cultural traditions that they hold on to. And they are very well aware of the threats that they are facing right now. And this will continue. This is not going to die. This is not going to be bought over as BJP is always able to do. And this is going to thrive, and this is going to spread. And the BJP is really afraid now because of its political implications. Hopefully someday I'll probably be able to share it in further details.
Yeah, that would be great. We as FA would like to have you in our colloquium for sure. We'll contact you on that. That would be great. So it's already 2:30, has been one very interesting hour. Thank you, Pallav, very much. We have learned a lot, I think, and we will be happy to continue our collaboration with your organization and with you as well. And thanks to all of you who have taken part of this colloquium. And well, have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.